Good morning. Welcome to Coffee and a Word. This week is a pretty important, pretty heavy week for Christians, especially as we go forward and we think about everything that happened, everything that culminated at the end of the week. So we're going to read in Luke today, chapter 23. I'm going to go through verses 1 through about verse 43. This might be a little longer time together today. I hope you guys don't mind. I think it's important that we really digest this, marinate on this week. It's the backbone of why we're Christians. It's the backbone of why we are called to emulate Christ. And it's very important that we take this as an example and that we live by it. So I hope you can bear in mind with me this morning, spend a little more time, have maybe 2 cups of coffee. So I'm going to go ahead and get started reading. We'll read verse 1 through, I guess, about verse 23. Okay. So Luke chapter 23, verse 1. Then the whole assembly arose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, dressing him in an elegant robe, and they sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends, for before this they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him, and then release him." But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city, and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the 3rd time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. As we mull over and we chew on that, I want to pull out something that I think might be overlooked a lot of times. It's something that came to my heart last night as I was preparing. So as we go through these 25 verses, I want to pull out how many times did Pilate allow the Jews a chance to turn around and repent? How many times did Pilate try and appease them with something else so that they would make the right decision? Pilate said he could find no guilt. He knew this man was innocent. And he tried so many times. And after each time he tried, the Jewish people didn't see it, realize it, or even try and open their eyes, but they actually closed their eyes harder. They hardened their hearts more towards Jesus. It's shades of kind of what Pharaoh did with Moses. And it says Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it's not that God wanted Pharaoh to stay in his hardness. It was that God confirmed him in the decision he insisted on making. So we see that here in the New Testament now. And then look at today. How many chances does God give us? How many times does God say, no, don't do that? And we ignore him. And then something else happens and the Lord allows the results to be a little harsher. And we ignore him. And we go on our way and we continue living the lifestyle of sin that we're in. And things get a little worse and God allows a little more heartache in different ways or different aspects. And then we start to hate him for it. And all the time he was giving us chance after chance after chance to redeem and to turn back away from the road we were heading down. I know in my life that happened a lot until it came to such a head that it was either choose him or choose death. And I think this is where that begins. And what we're going through is just a repeat in the cycle of history. We hear that a lot, that history tends to repeat itself. And I think this is a point in this passage that a lot of us overlook is even here the Lord was giving Jews chance after chance after chance through Pilate to turn back. But as we all know that this needed to happen for our salvation, it's just another aspect about how all of these pieces, all of these lessons were playing a part all at the same time. The grand design of God through all of this. So I'm going to read those instances just so we can really see it. Verse 1, it says, the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him. It says, we found this man subverting our nation. And Pilate questions Jesus. And he says, I find no basis for a charge against him. He sends him to Herod. Herod also sends him back. And Pilate says, Herod didn't find a reason to condemn him. And they say, away, release Barabbas to us, who was a murderer, an insurrectionist, or a rebel, a violent rebel. And still they kept saying, crucify him. And then again, it says, a third time, Pilate appealed to them. And they didn't want anything to do with it. And finally, Pilate gave them just what they asked for. And that's point one of what I'm trying to make this morning, is thinking about how many chances were we given? How real and how deep does God's forgiveness run for us to give us chance after chance? We look at it as he doesn't care sometimes when things get worse, and why is he not making it better? But maybe it's us that have to change our perspective and see that it's our reluctance to change, our reluctance to see what's going on in here, and to make those changes is actually the driving force behind things getting worse. The second point I want to pull out of this, if those weren't heavy enough for a Monday morning, I really want to pull out what is our job as emulators of Christ, as followers of Christ, as disciples of Christ. Because as Christians, that's what we're called to do. We're called to be Christ-like. We're called to learn to be as he is, as he thinks, to see the world through his eyes. That's the whole point of being a Christian. So how, on this Holy Week, can we chew on a little more of how we can be like Christ? So I want to talk about forgiveness in the light that, what was the cost, right? What was the cost that Jesus paid for us? So I'm going to read the rest of the verses, verse 26 through 43. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon the Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who had mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, Golgotha, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the king of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said. Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Some heavy words, heavy thoughts, a heavy image. I'm going to make it a little heavier. Luke, where we were reading through, is a little different than the other gospel accounts, in so that it doesn't detail really the scourging that Jesus went through, and that's a huge part of the crucifixion. So scourging in this point, if you've never heard that term before and you're not really sure what it is, scourging was a form of punishment. It was a very harsh and brutal form of punishment. It was not considered the death penalty. So keep that in there as I'm explaining. Not considered the death penalty, or a form of a death penalty. It was usually done with something called a cat of nine tails, which was a leather staff with 9 strands of leather coming out of it. The strands of leather could have been less or more, but that was generally why it was called that. And on the end of each strand of leather was a piece of sharp debris. Could have been clay, could have been metal bits, rock, whatever they could find that would tear into the flesh or lacerate the flesh. And so they would stand behind you. You would be tied to a post. If you've seen The Passion of the Christ, that's probably a pretty closely accurate depiction of how that would have went. The person may have been standing, probably not, because to have them secure and not falling all over the place, it probably would have been better that they weren't. But then as they whipped you for a set amount of times, these bits would hit your flesh, and like I said, whatever would cut it open. And the way this was described by historians, not necessarily the Bible, but what we call extra-biblical sources, historians and people that are studiers of that time period say that most people that went through scourging, when they were done, you could see their organs. And not just the color or you think it was. No, you would see them so clearly, you would know what they are. You would be sure. There would be no question of what am I looking at there. That's pretty intense. You weren't just cut deep into it, but your flesh was torn in a way that you could see what was underneath. So imagine going through that type of beating, and then you are nailed to a cross. Your back bare, so your flesh is riding against that cross. That's bad enough. But then to be able to breathe while you're hanging there and all your chest is sinking down, to be able to breathe, you actually have to push yourself up to take a breath. So you would purposely have to rake your back against that wooden post just to get some air as you're hanging there. And we think about how much Jesus spoke while he was on the cross. We didn't go over that, but I implore you to read the rest of this and count how many times Jesus had to speak. Because think about this, that not only did Jesus have to take a breath when he wanted to breathe, but he had to take a deep breath anytime he wanted to speak. So for him just to speak the words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," he had to push up, rake his back against that post, speak those words, and then let his back sink against that post again. Again, I know these are really heavy thoughts. I know they're heavy words. I know it's hard to picture in our heads what this must have been like for him. But it's so important that especially this week that we close our eyes and we envision this. Because that's the cost that our forgiveness, that's the cost. A cost that we never have to pay. A cost that we never have to worry about reaching down somewhere inside and going through that. So as we're chewing on those thoughts, my other point this morning is, how willing are we to forgive others the way that Christ so freely forgave us? And to personalize it a little further, I'm going to ask you to say in your head or out loud if you can, how willing am I to forgive the way that Christ forgave me? If Christ can go through the pain and the suffering, we read over and over again that he was mocked, that he was spit on, that he was enticed to call the angels from heaven to save him. And the reality is that he could have. And he voluntarily hung on that cross. That's the point, the voluntary part, right? So we need to voluntarily forgive those that we feel so deeply have wronged us. Those words, for they know not what they do. It's the first words that Jesus spoke on the cross. Forgive them, Father. The only man that could have justly snapped his fingers and lit them all on fire. Justly done that. They deserved that. And not only did he not do that, but he went the step further to forgive them in the midst of them still mocking him. And because he's God, he knew what was coming. So he knew that there was even more in store after the initial mocking before he was crucified. For me, I always wonder what it must have been like for the Roman soldier that nailed those nails through Jesus's wrists. We know the Greek word for hand means wrist. So that would have been more accurately, especially with the bones that are there. It's actually, if you feel here, you can feel a hole. And that's probably where they put those nails through, just to personalize this a little further for you, if all this wasn't heavy enough. So I want all of us challenged this week, this Holy Week, with the thoughts of what our Lord did for each and every one of us, giving us time after time after time to come to him after he went through all of this to forgive us. So this week, I want to really be challenged if how much further can we forgive outside of our comfort zone? So not just going beyond, we've been talking a lot at our church, but to go beyond in forgiveness. Who have we been holding forgiveness from? Who have we sat there and go, but Lord, I just can't do it. I just can't forgive that, not yet. Where would we be at if Jesus, during his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, instead of his prayer being, Lord, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me, but let your will be done. Instead of saying that, what if he said, Lord, I'm not ready to forgive these people yet. And he snapped his fingers and never went on the cross. So before we hold our forgiveness back, let us really internalize, chew on, and marinate on the fact that the Lord has never held his forgiveness from us. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for mulling these questions over with me. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'd really love to hear from any of you that have gone outside of the box this week, have gone outside of your forgiveness comfort zone. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a great Holy Week. I know that I will be worshiping with each one of you on our Resurrection Sunday. That's the time for us to really remember and enjoy the return of our King the first time from the dead, as we wait on the return of him the second time. So from my family to yours, be healthy, be safe, and be the blessing.